Hello and welcome everyone. This panel is titled Global Militarization of Police, Black Freedom and International Solidarity. My name is Amaya Cook and I have the honor of introducing our panelist and our moderator. Our first panelist today is one of the leading intellectual voices in the United States. Dr. Mark Lamont Hill is currently the host of BET News and the Coffee and Books podcast. An award-winning journalist, Dr. Hill has received numerous prestigious awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Dr. Hill is a Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University. Prior to that, he held positions at Columbia University and Morehouse College. Since his days as a youth in Philadelphia, Dr. Hill has been a social justice activist and organizer. He has worked on campaigns to end the death penalty, abolish prisons, and release numerous political prisoners. Dr. Hill has also worked in solidarity with human rights movements around the world. He is the founder and director of the People's Education Center in Philadelphia, as well as the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. Ebony Magazine has named him one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. Dr. Hill holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. His research agenda focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education in the United States and the Middle East. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Hill, for being here.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Oluwole Ojewale. He is a scholar and program management expert on the disparate yet connected fields of transnational organized crime, urban governance, policing, conflict, resilience, and democratization. He possesses about a decade experiences across an array of development interventions in West Africa. His research and advocacy campaigns span transnational organized crime in West Africa, community policing, accountable governance of justice and security, pandemic policing and human rights, preventing and countering violent extremism, civil-military relations, Afrobarometer survey on democracy, governance, and economic conditions in Africa, and election security management. Oluwole has conducted community-based qualitative and quantitative research on community resilience to violent conflicts, vulnerability assessment, disaster risk management, security threat assessment, counterinsurgency and security around the Lake Chad Basin. Oluwole has been trained by the European Union and the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies on countering violent extremism. Oluwole has published research articles in leading peer-reviewed journals and also co-authored Urbanization and Crime in Nigeria, published with the Palgrave Macmillan and adjudged as the first comprehensive book on the intersection between urbanization and crime in Nigeria. Oluwole has visited Austria, Ethiopia, Germany, Ghana, Somalia, South Africa, Switzerland, Tunisia, and Turkey for study, work, and conferences. Thank you so much, Oluwole, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Sarah Nahar. She is a nonviolent action trainer and interspiritual theologian passionate about ecological regeneration, community cultivation, and spiritual activism. A current second-year PhD student in Syracuse, New York, Haudenosaunee Confederacy traditional land, her research focus is on the concepts of waste, how orienting stories about the earth influence toileting practices of religious people, and the necessary worldwide shift to ecological sanitation. Her home department is religion at Syracuse University, and she is matriculating concurrently at neighboring SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, the Department of Environmental Studies. Sarah was a 2019 Rotary Peace Fellow in Thailand, and in 2018, worked at generational bridge building, the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta, Georgia. Previously, she was the executive director in oppression in global locations severely impacted by US imperialist policies. She attended Spelman College, majoring in comparative women's studies and international studies while minoring in Spanish. There, she co-founded the Atlanta University Center and was student government president. She has an MDiv from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in her hometown. Liberation theology learning, transnational feminist solidarity, capoeira, and soccer have allowed her to travel to 71 countries. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yes, absolutely.
Our final panelist is Dr. Lucas Keyboy. Dr. Keyboy holds a PhD degree in ethics and African philosophy from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Keyboy is distinguished by his passion for research, focusing on good governance. He has attended a number of invited international conferences where he has presented papers and given speeches. Presently, Dr. Keyboy works as a principal policy analyst with the Kenya Institute for Public Policy and Research Analysis, Governance Department. He is also a consultant on governance, democracy, and human rights. He has written numerous publications centering policing reforms to enhance security in Kenya and the Achilles heel of police reforms in Kenya. Dr. Keyboy is currently enrolled for a Bachelor of Law degree at UNICAF University. Thank you, Dr. Keyboy, for being here, and welcome everyone, our attendees and our panelists again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. One last, but certainly not least, moderator of our panel today. The moderator for this panel is our very own Lesedi Graveline. Lesedi is a Botswana American set to graduate from Harvard Divinity School with a Master of Theological Studies in May 2021. At Harvard, she explores the history and narratives of the African diaspora, Black cultural production, and transformative justice. She is most interested in storytelling, fostering spaces of resistance, radical inquiry, and growth. Some of Lesedi's most projects at Harvard include co-editing and co-creating a 100-page literary magazine that celebrates Black and Brown contemporary creators titled Freedom School, a seminar on theory and praxis for Black students in the United States. She received her BA from the University of Connecticut, where she double majored in human rights and women's studies. Lesedi is passionate about expanding her leadership through mentoring and empowering young people. Her most urgent tasks include embodying ethical leadership and navigating the connection between personal transformation and social change. Thank you so much, Lesedi. And once again, thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Amaya, for those beautiful introductions. Thank you all for being here. Hello, welcome, dumelang, as we would say in my culture. I am so excited to be here with all of you and to be in community and to have this group of esteemed, distinguished, and phenomenal panelists. Those bios were insane, who are practitioners, activists, leaders, scholars, so much more. Please feel free to drop your name in the chat and where you're calling in from. We really want to attempt to make this as normal as possible and to have this be a beautiful community where we're in conversation, at least to the extent that we can. So to ground us a little bit in this specific panel around the global militarization of police, Black freedom, and international solidarity, I want us to think about how there is an irony and unfortunate reality of the violence implemented by the very forces that are ostensibly meant to protect and serve our communities. The movement for Black lives and its stand against white supremacy and state-sanctioned violence inflicted upon Black communities has become this movement that transcends national borders. Around the world, we've seen countries galvanize, and these protests speaking out against law enforcement agencies that are designed to maintain this cultural hegemony, these social hierarchies, and public control through brute force. When we think about policing as an institution, it relies on this culture of fear, and policing in its many forms as a global institution is a greater tactic of state repression. Militarized police tactics are utilized and exchanged from country to country, and so the same must be true of methods of revolution. I think that while the connection lies in the systemic issues plaguing countries like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, Palestine, we could just go on, and the United States, of course, solidarity can be found in the desire and the will of the people for liberation, specifically Black liberation. And as Fannie Lou Hamer would say, nobody's free until everybody's free. And so ultimately, to end my little spiel, what I think is important about this discussion is understanding how the structures of power that oppress people in one country are inherently tethered to the structures of power that oppress people in this country, and to see what Black freedom looks like on a global scale. And so with that, I will hand this off to each of the panelists. We'll go through each one and just, you'll have your time to shine. Please, everybody in the audience, feel free to drop questions and ask the panelists anything you'd like about these topics. Like I said, we're trying to replicate what this would be like if we were really in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now. So I think we're gonna start with Dr. Kivoy. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Lesedi. As I had said, in Kenya, it's 8 p.m. now from East Africa. It's a great honor and a privilege to be part of this year's Black Freedom Month. And I take this as with humility. Now, to go to the issue at hand, statistics indicate that a Black person in the United States is 3 times likely to get killed when they encounter a police officer. In the United States, a Black person, and I believe also people of color. In Kenya, a poor person is likely to get killed or brutalized by the police whenever they encounter each other. And these researches and studies do not tell us if these individuals have committed crime or not. As Lesedi has indicated, policing is not a war institution. It is a service institution. So when you talk of the global militarization of the police, to me, what it entails is when you look around, you see police officers in armored personal carriers, in heavy bulletproof vests, in carrying heavy rifles, machine guns. In Kampala, for example, Uganda, which is our neighboring country here, it is normal to see a police officer carrying a machine gun in the streets. So you ask yourself, what is this gentleman or lady doing in the streets with a machine gun, with an AK-47, with a G3, with an M16 or M14? Those are weapons of war. You see them with grenades. So we ask ourselves, is it a war or is it a public service? Because policing is a service. Now, in your country, Lesedi, the SWAT team, special weapon and tactic, they are going to arrest maybe someone who has jumped bail. Do you need all the brutality that we see on television and in documentaries where some of your citizens celebrate police brutality and those kind of barbaric actions that are meted out on Black people in your country? In Kenya, the people who suffer, as I have indicated, are the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. And you either pay a bribe or you get killed. When we had this COVID pandemic, it is still going on. They were using tear gas and bullets to stop coronavirus. Any connection? I'll tell you no, there's no connection. Who is the biggest exporter of global police militarization to the rest of the world? United States of America is the biggest exporter of militarization of the police to the rest of the world. And I'm going to give an example of my country. We have got units within the police force or the police service that are trained by the Delta Force. Delta Force in the United States is not a police unit. That is a military unit, Delta Force. They are trained by the Navy SEAL. Navy SEAL, to the best of my knowledge, is not a police unit in the United States of America. Those are military units. And I think some of them train in Maryland state, close to Washington. There must be a military facility there where they are normally trained on how to brutalize their own brothers and sisters. They are given equipment. And this morning I was reading an article about some hardware that the United Kingdom is going to give our police. And those are military hardware equipment. But as I said, the United States is the biggest exporter. They also have a camp here in Kenya. They train police. Coming to the next issue, why? What are the causes of this global militarization of the police? One of them is the war on terror or terrorism. The countries have used that to militarize their policing units so that they use the same tactics that are supposed to be in battlefield. They're using them when dealing with the civilians. That should not be the case. Then the second thing is the war on drugs. Those South America, even in Kenya, we have got drug cartels. And they are trained by American units, by American personnel. They are given armored personnel carriers. They are given machine guns. They are given weapons. They are given drones. And the drug dealers don't stay in bushes or forests. They stay in communities. So if you give police officers armored personnel carriers, you are giving them even tanks. They are given grenade launchers to deal with drug traffickers or drug dealers who basically reside in communities. What message are you sending to these officers? That they can use those weapons on unarmed civilians who may just be minding their own business. Then we also need to look at the breakdown of institutions of governance. And if these institutions have broken down, those in power have to intimidate and coerce the people that they are ruling. And as you know, most African countries, elections are never fair. They are stolen, they are rigged, and all manner of things. And the other day I saw your country, one of the candidates claiming that elections were stolen. I think you should come to Africa so that you can teach him how elections are stolen and how policemen are used to brutalize civilians. On that point, when the mob stormed the US Capitol Hill, which was built by slaves, even the White House, and we saw that the police officers who were there were outnumbered, my assumption was this. I imagined if those rioters, one of them had been Louis Farrakhan or the Black Lives Matter protesters, I'm sure we will have seen SWAT teams in armored personnel carriers, helicopters, actually Apache helicopters and Black Hawks overflying the area and shooting tear gas and water cannons at these Black Lives Matter protesters who are not armed. Now here are rioters who, who should have been stopped in the first place. But what do you see the response? What that told us is that the issue of police violence in the United States of America is institutionalized into some form of racism, whereby the blacks are the ones who are on the receiving end. When you militarize the police in the US, basically you are telling them you can use this equipment on black people and people of color, but whites can come and do anything they want. We saw that in the Capitol Hill. Then also we need to blame the training curriculum. I'll use a not so friendly word. The training curriculum of all police institutions across the globe are extremely barbaric and archaic. Why am I saying that? In the United States of America, you employ soldiers to work as police officers. People who are trained as military men and military women, why are you employing them to work as police officers? And they are used to those equipments that they use in the military. Now in Africa, most police officers in the streets, you will see them patrolling with AK-47 rifles, G3 rifles. You will hardly see them with handguns. I ask myself, what is a police officer doing in a community with an AK-47 rifle, with a G3, with an M16? So we need to change our training curriculum. Then we ask ourselves, what are the consequences of the militarization of police institutions across the globe? One of them, we have seen the police arrogance, especially white police officers, if it is in your country. Then in Africa, most police officers are extremely arrogant. They will not want questions. If you question them what they are doing, you will be shot. Then we see the decline in public trust in policing institutions. And that makes it very difficult even for police officers themselves, because not all police officers are bad. well-meaning police officers will find it very difficult to secure communities because people don't trust them. The level of trust goes very, very low. Then also you see the violation of basic fundamental rights of citizens, unnecessary searches, unnecessary traffic stops in your country. And those are the things that normally come up. Then we see cases of crime prevention being militarized. In Kenya, if a crime happens in a particular area, what the police will do, they'll come with their trucks and round up people, communities, and take them for interrogation. You'll be lucky if you'll be released, but chances are they'll have some charges leveled against you. By the time you come out, it will be months down the line if you're lucky, or years. Then lastly, we ask ourselves, what needs to change? What needs to change? One, police officers themselves. Change must come from within the policing institutions across the globe, because you will not force them to change if they don't want to change. Then also, we need to look at the concept of community policing, because communities know where drug dealers stay, they know where criminals stay, they know where kidnappers stay, they know where human traffickers stay. You don't need military tanks and helicopters to identify and isolate these bad apples within communities. You only need intelligence. Then you also need to look at the issue of ensuring that there is more police accountability in each and every country. In Kenya, you have got the Internal Affairs Unit, which is within the police. We have got the Independent Police Oversight Authority. But now, if you look at the number of cases reported, it makes it very difficult even for this community to discharge its mandate. Then you also need to look at the issue of law enforcement being seen as a service, not as a war. Law enforcement is a public service. Now, to wind up, maybe for the United States of America, which have got the police unions, you need to conduct research on the nexus between police unions and police barbarism and violence. Because researches that I have read and articles I've read on the media, and I've talked to friends who stay in your country, they tell me that the police unions in your country are the biggest obstacle to police reforms in the United States of America, because they protect rogue elements within police departments across all the 50 or 51 states in your country. So we as citizens of the globe, each country has got its own unique challenges, but we need to have a global voice and say, enough is enough. We need to have a humane policing framework that respects the lives of citizens, that ensures that people live in dignity. As in Africa, I'm normally disgusted when we see Black people in your country being shot, being brutalized simply by their skin color. That should not be the case. Those Black people who are in the United States of America were taken there by force. They were slaves, and they have to enjoy the life of the United States of America. They have to live in dignity, as opposed to being stigmatized because of their color. So countries have unique challenges, but they need to come together and work towards reforming policing. I'm sorry I have taken 2 minutes more longer than you have taken. I'm very sorry for that.
Don't be sorry. It's all good. It's a weird echo right now. I'm not sure why. I appreciate you calling us out as a country. Honestly, I think we definitely need it. I appreciate you speaking about the paramilitary unit that it seems like is happening across the world. Sarah, the stage is yours. I will attempt to tell you that your time is up.
Greetings of peace, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year. Those who are celebrating in the new moon. Thanks for those broad strokes that you laid out, Dr. Kivoy, and looking forward to heading into the case example around SARS in Nigeria after I speak a little bit here. Significant profits is made in the deadly exchange of weapons, tactics, ideas, and data between militaries and police, immigrations and customs enforcement, border patrol, FBI. War is big business. And as policing militarizes each day, so there also is more money being made. And in the US, our taxes are paying that cost, both 53% of our federal budget for war making and increasing shares of our local budgets for police units. Yet still the highest cost is not dollars, it's our lives. For the security that comes at a point of a gun is no security at all. At most is a temporary deterrent, and usually the threat of lethal force or its use multiplies violence and amplifies trauma. So it is for this reason that in 2015, the Chicago Black Lives Matter coordinated nonviolent direct actions to shut down the International Association of the Chiefs of Police. That was a conference trading in this deadly exchange of weapons, tactics, ideas, and data. We blocked main roads, we locked down entrances, we blockaded the pedestrian bridge between the hotel and the conference center, and we infiltrated the proceedings to request an end to this association and an immediate pivot to a conversation associated with true security, funding community mental health instead of tanks, funding neighborhood schools and libraries instead of invasive surveillance systems, funding public restrooms instead of the proliferation of these zero tolerance policies concerning indecent exposure because people can't find a place to use a restroom. Our sweatshirts read, "Fund Black Futures." And as the arrests of us began, we sang about our ancestors watching and protecting us. And the chant, "Who do you serve? Who do you protect?" rang out. Those years of Black liberation led to a new wave of internationalism. Folks directed their limited time and resources towards traveling abroad to learn from Black and other marginalized communities about the impact of the US's exportation of this white supremacist Christian hegemonic politic. At that time, I led an international organization committed to building partnerships to transform violence and oppression. And so had a chance to assist in making some of those connections for folks. And what came to the surface over and over was that if we don't want militarized police in the United States treating our neighborhoods like war zones, then we can't allow it done on our behalf over there. BLM groups began to more explicitly dismantle American exceptionalism in their analysis about what liberation looks like, and to recognize how the dehumanization of our communities and the dehumanization of those called enemies by the US were connected by the same exploitation, and we have the same fate. So we began to question what was done in the name of US security. In whose neighborhoods are our troops showing up abroad and policing, often with extremely lethal consequences, as we've heard, and because of calculations, sometimes eliminated, killed solely based on the location and presumed connections, and often bombed from above, including now drones. And if we don't want that happening more often here, we must resist it happening anywhere. In our work for liberation and violence reduction, that means following the chain of profit, but also it means reducing our reliance on military and police to keep us safe. That way, when we hear said, "Oh, we are protecting on your behalf, this is for freedom and security," we can honestly say, like a group of families did of victims of 9/11/2001, they said, "Not in our name. You will not mobilize our grief for war. You will not mobilize our grief." So how do we reduce our reliance? We talk to our housemates, talk to our families, our organizations about what alternatives we have instead of calling the police. We can start conversations on how to determine protocols. So all sorts of things will come up as you discuss with people you know. Questions about how one perceives safety and experiences safety, and how questions of safety and security relate, and questions of boundaries and how boundaries are different than borders, and how one's boundary relates to one's limits. All of this stuff will come up as we figure out how to handle highly conflictual situations. These are revolutionary conversations. But any agreements among affinity groups made on the basis of these empathetic, real, generative conversations, they will make a difference in the future. You can make agreements and try it for a trial period, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer, but results of conversations like this might be something like, if someone is afraid to be at home alone, or they might be tempted to call the police if they're home alone and they hear something or see someone, maybe there's a policy that you have in your house, a protocol that always has two people at home. Or maybe there's a phone call that you can make before calling the cops, such as if you see someone who's impacted by opioid use, who can you call? Who's got Narcan? If someone is acting in a way that you perceive aggressively, who's your buddy that knows de-escalation skills? What is the accompaniment you need whenever you might want to walk somewhere or even wait for a bus? All of these create security that is with one another, security in relationships. And what we learned in Christian Peacemaker Teams, that organization that continues to work in third-party nonviolent intervention, going where we're invited to support the building of partnerships that transform violence and oppression. One thing we learned from the People's Feminist Organization, the Organización Femenino Popular in Colombia, was when there was a family dispute, particularly domestic violence, they could immediately initiate a phone tree and 20 women would show up and surround a house. So the perpetrator couldn't go anywhere. And they were there together brainstorming about what it took to create safety within that home. 20 people also means there's 20 sets of eyes for seeing folks, or 20 sets of ears for hearing folks, but 20 people paying attention, which means extreme community accountability. What would it take to have a network like that, phone tree like that? That meant people could also take shifts being at the house, watching, helping to de-escalate, not just in one moment, but over time. So these conversations, they'll touch on understandings of self-defense, or perhaps even questions of mortality, like willingness to die rather than to kill, and how to reduce harm to all parties in these situations. These are super powerful conversations. They're ones I've been in have been pretty humbling. And after you feel your initial maybe resistance to shift, being able to imagine and articulate a world beyond the use of lethal force, so many creative solutions emerge. In fact, many marginalized communities who have not been able to rely on the cops for protection have some of these methods built in now. Homeless folks, undocumented folks. And these are groups with whom we can have these methods of revolution conversations. This is also happening on the scale of Denver as a city. And for the past 6 months, Denver has been running a bit of a pilot program to replace the police when 911 is called for up to 7 different reasons connected to homelessness, substance abuse, poverty. And they're building on what they learned from Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. They built something called the Support Team Assisted Response, the STAR program. And it's been saving lives and saving lots of money. And the big question that they're wondering is, could something that was piloted in Oregon, small scale, work in Denver? And the data that they pulled from their pilot is a resounding yes. So there is a 6-month report for you to read, and I'll be dropping in the chat 2 resources related to this. One with the North Star, which is Black and Latinx journalists coming together. They wrote about it. And also I'll be popping in the chat information about Deadly Exchange, which is focusing on these exchanges between 2 particular countries. But in Denver, of the 748 calls that the STAR program took in their first 6 months, not a single person was arrested. Denver police were even called in for backup. No one was killed. No one was sent to jail or given criminal records. All lives were saved. Over 200 times, they responded to calls where people thought there was someone strange in the area. 150 calls were people calling to check in on a loved one who they were worried about. Another 100 to someone who needed assistance right away in their home, often because of mental or physical health challenges. And 50 calls, they responded about suicide. And they responded to each of these calls with love, compassion, without a weapon, demilitarized, yet safe, supported, and competent. And this reduced form of reliance, this can lead to abolition. It's happening step by step. Eugene, Denver, marginalized communities, and it can happen where you are. And these pilot projects also create meaningful jobs for more people in the caring professions along the way. In various faith and spiritual traditions, such as those that were spoke about in the first panel, they can nourish our ability to cultivate our warrior peacemaker spirit and our power to encounter increased difficulty. In conclusion, this conversation about reliance reduction is a revolutionary conversation, in that it will be one that questions a fundamental given in property-centered societies. It questions how we understand security. And in this, we have a transformation from a property-centered relationship with one another and with the police force, because police often protect property. It's going to interrogate power dynamics along the way, and it's revolutionary because we take additional responsibility for ourselves, and we're coming up with solutions that maintain the inherent worth and dignity of each person to live and to be on their own transformational journey. And I think these results will lead us to more and better questions, which is a revolutionary future I'm excited about. And along the way, they will also reduce the number of people arrested, abused, harmed, or killed. And that's crucial. Thank you.
Thank you so much for offering that wisdom. I think right now, thankfully, abolition is, alternatives for public safety is a little bit more widely accepted. A little bit more widely accepted, but I really appreciate you giving us really concrete examples of how that actually works in the world, because our knee-jerk reaction is to think we must have police and we must have prisons. And it's like, actually, we don't, if you've just been trained. And so thank you so much for that, Sarah. And I hope we have more discussion about your vision for our collective future in abolition in just a moment. But before that, Oluwole, you are up next. My friend, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Lesedi, and my co-panelists. Like I said in the course of our brief introduction, I will be focusing on the experiences in Nigeria and how that resonates with the global conversation around the militarization of police. And then, so for the United States of America, the conversation was about Black Lives Matter in the recent time. Why in Nigeria, it was about End SARS movements, which I believe you are quite aware about how it resonates across the world. So for us in Nigeria, the experience about police brutality, and at the same time talking about global militarization of police is something that it has an historical explanation, and then a contextual analysis can be gleaned from that. So we have a policing system that was rooted in command and control, which was actually handed over to us by the colonial master, the Western countries that came to colonize Africa. And you have a police system that has not been able to reform itself and comply with a global standard of modern policing. So rather than having a policing institution that is rendering service to the general public, what we have is a reflection of what you see in the military. And you look at Nigeria as a country that has years of military experience in terms of political leadership, where what you see is about command and control, and the citizens can't really argue with the police. They can't really engage the police in civilized conversation. It is something that is rooted in in brutality, subjugation, and a couple of other experiences that are similar to that. So we have a policing system that is established to fulfill the requirements, that is established to serve the import and the directive of the governing elite. And that is something that was carried over from the colonial experiences that we have had in Nigeria. So you have a police system that over the space of 60 years has not really reformed itself. The Police Act that we have in Nigeria was put in place in 1943. And that is the code that is still guiding police operation in Nigeria. So we have an experience of establishment of a special anti-robbery squad, which is popularly referred to as SAS in Nigeria, who is, was actually, a unit within the Nigerian police force that was actually put in place to check issues of criminality that has to do with armed robbery, but that metamorphosed over the year to become an instrument of subjugation and harassment and intimidation, particularly against the youth. So you have this experience of the federal government coming to say, we're going to reform the police, we're going to reform the SAS. And then for over a decade, that promise has never really materialized in the country. So we in October 2020, we move into this life-changing experience for the Nigerian youth who took to the streets to actually protest against police brutality. And then that movement resonated across the world in the United States of America, in Europe, Asia, and other places where you have Nigerians in the diaspora. But I must be quick to mention that, like Dr. Kivoy said, the America policing system exported this global militarization of police to the rest of the world. But it's also a shining example that what we saw in Nigeria took a radical departure from what we saw in the movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. In terms of methodology, in terms of approach, it resonates with us in Nigeria. So I think if America exported militarized policing system to the world, it's also instructive to see how America has also demonstrated leadership, particularly in terms of community movement that spearheaded the Black Lives Matter. And that resonated to Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, in countries where we have had police militarization over the years. So I need to also say that what drove the NSAS movement in Nigeria, it's not only about police brutality. It's a combination of several factors. You will recall that the youths have been largely marginalized and politically excluded. You have a chunk, a greater percentage of the youth deciding who wins the election, but they are really appointed into important political positions. They are really mainstream, even in terms of governance program into what the government is doing. So these are issues that resonate with the youth. And by extension, the conversation, the protest, the call for the ban of the special anti-robbery squad of the Nigerian police force extended beyond issues of human rights violation. It extended beyond issues of police brutality. It became a metaphor for and a call for improvement in governance in Nigeria. And why is that so? I need to quickly mention here that anywhere you see the wave of protest against the police, what the people are seeing in essence is that we have gotten enough of these maladministration, we have gotten enough of this poor governance from the state, and we are actually protesting against the state. The reason is this: the police is the symbol of state authority anywhere you go, because the primary responsibility of government is maintenance of law and order. And the police is the premier institution that is doing that in any country of the world. So anytime that the citizens can no longer bear issues of police brutality, what they are saying in essence is that enough of this bad governance. And that is what you are seeing across the world in places where movements have risen against police brutality. It's actually a protest against the state. The police as an institution is just a precursor into that. And then this is going to drive me in the direction of an argument and a reflection that I've had looking at experiences in Southeast Asia, in Africa, particularly in terms of the dichotomy of global North and global South. and what the experiences have looked like in terms of global militarization of police. And this is the question. You look at the United States of America, what police brutality means to an average American citizen is different from what it means to an average African here. Because in the United States of America, for instance, police brutality subjugation goes along racial lines of black and white. But when you come to Africa, it's a matter of a black policeman or a black policewoman oppressing a fellow black African in Africa. So it leads me in the direction of, if a black American citizen is protesting against police brutality in the United States, and that is undergirded by how he feels and how the right-wing elements, white supremacists, are going about using police as a tool to subjugate a black African in the United States of America, for instance. In Nigeria, in Africa, it is an experience of a black police officer who has been trained in the ethos and philosophy of colonial policing, which was rooted in subjugation and wanton human rights abuses. We are now having an experience of, after 60 years of independence, we've not been able to shed that toga of the policing institution, the code of conduct, the philosophy that the colonial masters that came to Africa handed to us, and the police institutions that they have built on this culture of subjugation, which has not been able to reflect the required police reform that we want to see in Africa. So I think for us in Africa, for instance, in Nigeria, we acknowledge the fact that we are experiencing police brutality, but the scourge is a global one, which for us doesn't go along racial line like you saw in the US, but it is a case of a fellow politician that was elected by community people, by citizens who get into power, and then employ police officers who go about oppressing the general public. And by extension, I also need to say that it's a cycle of violence, in the sense that an average black person in Nigeria, an average Nigerian, sees wearing a police uniform, holding a gun, and then holding a baton, and all these other instruments that the police use in carrying out their law enforcement duty as a tool of oppression against a fellow black person. And that is what we have seen in Nigeria, and what we have also seen in part of Africa. So for us, militarization of police has extended across all facets of governance and facets of our human lives, to the extent that election that is supposed to be a civil affair has now become so militarized that if you're having an election in Nigeria, the military services are going to be deployed. All other relevant law enforcement institutions are also going to be deployed. And we ask a question, as election degenerated to war, that you are seeing all these ammunitions being deployed just for basic exercise of franchise, which is the right to vote and to be voted for. The same thing also extends to public life for politicians in Nigeria. You find a situation whereby poor communities are poorly policed in Nigeria, but a politician goes around with a retinue of police officers who are just protecting his life alone. And then it has gotten to the point that the poor has no any option rather than to probably explore the option of policing themselves. So it is part of the militarization of the police, because the politician feels anywhere he goes, he must show that he has the tool and the connection, the police power to subjugate or to show to other members of the community, wherever the politician goes, that he's actually in charge. Because the true test of power for politicians is the ability to command the police. And we have had this poor policing system undergirded by poor policing philosophy, because the policing institution itself has become a tool in the hand of politicians who want to win election and subvert the electoral process. In other words, in summary, for you to access political power, for you to sustain political power, you really need to be in charge and command of the police. And it becomes a tool for rigging election, for fomenting violence during the election, and for all sorts of atrocities that the police have committed in Nigeria and even in Africa at large. So I think this conference for us, the centrality of my reflection is the fact that the global militarization of police is a general affair that plagues every nation. But in terms of the dichotomy of experience, there is a clear difference between what an American citizen is experiencing as far as militarization of police is concerned, compared with the experience we have in Africa. In summary, in the United States, it's about white supremacists, whereas in Nigeria or in any other African country, it is a matter of a fellow Black African police officer, policewoman, or policeman, using the tool of policing as an institution to oppress a fellow Black person. And if we want to drive reform along this line, we must take cognizance of the peculiarity of our culture, history, and context in addressing police reform that is actually going to position the police as a service-oriented agency rather than a military institution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dr. Hill, you are our final presentation.
I'm honored to be here, and thank you all for all who are watching for being here as well. It's a little hard to go last because everyone has said so much awesome stuff, and in many ways have laid out what I imagine to be the key issues here. So I'll lay out a few things that I think are important, and make sure we leave time for some Q&A. I am, as Douglas and Sarah and Oluwole were speaking, there were so many things that were important to me. One was a critique of policing as system, not thinking about bad apples, not thinking about individual character, while those things certainly play into particular interactions, thinking about policing as a system. Also, the need to be context specific, to understand that policing is a certain thing, but it can't be disconnected from the particular foundation and formation of the country, the nation state, the city in which it plays out. So what policing looks like in West Africa will be very different than what policing may look like in Northeast Africa versus what it may look like in Latin America versus what it may look like in Philadelphia. And so thinking about that is super important, but also thinking about the transnational dynamic of policing and of militarization and of violence, that we have to think about this in transnational context, that we don't have the luxury, either politically, intellectually, morally, or what have you, of thinking about our own silos, our own context in isolation from everyone else. Because white supremacy doesn't stop at the border. Capitalism doesn't have a passport or a visa. And so we have to think about these things in a different sort of way. And the idea of, and this was implicit in everyone's, it came up a lot in Sarah's, but it really is implicit in everyone's conversation. That is, how do we deploy the radical imagination in such a way that we can imagine new possibilities? That for me is so important here. In Philadelphia, I'm going to give a couple of examples that I think speak to the bigger picture and that allow us to think through this stuff in a different way. In Philadelphia, Walter Wallace was killed by the police in November. Walter Wallace was standing in West Philadelphia. He was holding a knife, and the police came and they killed him. And for some people, this was yet another example of police-involved violence, of police shooting, another example of state violence, another example of how and why we need to reimagine policing. Other people said, look, if you running at me with a knife and I had a gun, I probably would shoot too. I would concede that point. I can't promise that if you ran at me with a knife and I had a gun, I might not shoot. But that's why I'm not a police officer, and that's why I try not to carry guns. But more importantly, the question is, how can we think about that incident, right, where this man is having a mental health episode and ends up being killed, beyond the interaction? Because at the interactional level, yeah, you might do what the officer did, but the question is, what are the forces, what are the circumstances, what are the logics that get us into a position where the officer is forced to make that choice, or where Walter Wallace is forced to make that choice? So that's where we're trying to get here today, right? And that's the bigger picture, right? How do we get into a situation where when Walter Wallace's mother sees her son having a mental health episode, the only person she can call for relief is an armed police force? That's the first question, right? She didn't want the police. She wanted an ambulance. She wanted a van. She wanted support for her son. She didn't want them to come and arrest him. She didn't want them to come and shoot him. And the police had come several times before, so they knew what they were dealing with. I think at one point it was different officers, but the point is there was a mechanism for knowing what was needed for him. So we have someone who has a mental health episode. We have an armed police force, and now the armed police force is sending there with a gun, with a guy coming at him with a knife. How does this happen? How do we get here? These are the questions that I want us to wrestle with a little bit. And that's where I think the vision of abolition that you alluded to begins to come into play. Abolition is not just about saying we want a world without prisons, although it is. Abolition is not just about saying we want a world without police, although it is. Abolition is also an affirmative vision of the world we do want to see. And so when people talk to me about abolition, I don't start by saying, what does the world look like with nobody in prison? Or what does the world look like with a dismantled structure? Or what does the world look like with no police officers? That's the wrong question. For me, I begin with, what does the world look like if everyone's needs were being met? What would the world look like if our needs were being met? And in this case, if Walter Wallace had access to mental health resources, institutions that were meant to invest in him rather than contain and blame him and criminalize him, what could the world look like? What could the world look like if people had medical addictions treated, right, rather than criminalized in the case of crack or heroin, et cetera? What does this look like? That has to be the place where we begin, because then we can begin to imagine the role of policing differently. So when we have the defunding conversation, which for me is an important one, but can sometimes be a scaled down, domesticated vision of abolition, how can we have the defunding conversation if we don't understand what we're defunding for and what we're defunding to, right? So that so that police officer who's getting called is being called because we don't have a drug caseworker there, because we don't have a social worker, because that money wasn't put into treatment, because that money wasn't put into mental health. We need a different way of doing this, because if the only tool I have in my house is a hammer, then everything is going to look like a nail. And so we have a bunch of problems, and we have one way to solve it, and that is with policing. And so we have to reimagine that. We have to trigger that radical imagination. I'm going to pivot just for the interest of time. Again, we have to think about this in global context. You know, one of the things that's come up are the deadly exchanges. And the deadly exchanges, of course, the framework of the deadly exchange has been used to talk about police exchange programs between the United States of America and Israel. I'm going to add a caveat to this. It is important when we talk about deadly exchange programs that we frame it properly. You know, it's not that Israel is teaching teaching cops how to shoot Black people, or teaching cops how to shoot people. America has known how to shoot and kill Black people long before Israel was founded in 1948, right? And we do run the risk. We run the risk of, if we frame the narrative in that way, it becomes an anti-Semitic, what we call a blood libel, right? Because we're essentially saying Israel is teaching Black folk, teaching America how to kill Black folk. No, what we should do is think about how these tactics are happening in two countries that are ostensible democracies, but that are also increasingly authoritarian, because America is also teaching Israel. And what are we seeing? What are the similarities? We're seeing the rise of the security state, right? The counterterrorism approach to policing. So in Israel, you'll see Palestinians, whether, I don't care if they're inside of the state of Israel, or if they're in the West Bank, Gaza, what have you, they're seen as less than citizens. They're seen as outside threats that are treated with a counterterrorism approach. What we saw in Milwaukee, what we saw in New York, what we saw in Philadelphia was protesters being treated very similarly. They're being treated like what? Like outside threats, not as citizens who need to be engaged, but as outside threats. That plays into everything. And Douglas talks about this, right? That's a sharp contrast to what we saw at the Capitol. They were citizens, right? They got all the love. So let's contrast those two things. But also, again, the abolitionist imagination says it's not that I want a whole bunch of people at the Capitol arrested, locked up, shot, and beaten. It's not like I'm not mad that Dylan Roof got Burger King. I'm mad that Black folk don't get fed, right? We have to imagine, right? I don't want sky-high bail rates for white shooters. I want to get rid of cash bail because it's an inhumane and ultimately racist, but certainly classist system, right? That's the system. We got to reimagine what our end goals are. And so when we talk about these deadly exchange programs, the question is, what does it mean to have counterterrorism approach? What does it mean to have a security state where the deprivation of human rights becomes where security becomes the pretext for the deprivation of human rights? Well, we have to do this because we won't be safe otherwise, right? And again, this isn't Israel teaching America. This is about a rising kind of authoritarianism that we're seeing all around the world. That's just one example of it, right? We have to think about policing as bound up in systems of capital, as Sarah said, right? It's about thinking about policing. The history of policing is protecting property, and the property of who? The value, those who are valued by society, the privileged, the powerful, the bourgeoisie. We have to imagine and reimagine policing. We have to reimagine these relationships, and as you said, Lesedi, we have to reimagine what resistance looks like. Because if the threat is global, the resistance must be. But it must begin with an abolitionist imagination. You know, I have 2 books out that just came out. I'm partly doing a cheap plug, but actually I do think there's something important in this. And we still here at the end, I talk about the abolitionist imagination, and I have a book that comes out on Tuesday, which I really want y'all to support. It's called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, which get into some of the stuff that I just talked about. And one of the things I'm trying to say is we need to imagine the world differently, right? Since we're in a divinity school. Think about Howard Thurman in the context of the growing edge, right? When he talks about Jesus on the cross, right? And this isn't purely like a narrative for people who are like religious folk. You can do this from a secular space as well. But what Thurman talks about is the importance of thinking beyond the moment that we're in, the importance of thinking beyond the exact moment. And so he looks to Jesus on the cross, right? And what he says is, as Jesus did not, how can I put it? He said, we should never scale down our aspirations to the level of the facts in our present situation, right? He saw the scandal of the cross, right? And he said that this man was being subjected to cruel, unusual punishment, an unjust death sentence by the Roman government because of his radical politics. We could look at that moment on the cross as a site of death, as a site of tragedy, right? But the point is that we can't linger in the space of death, right? Thurman points to the resurrection and says that's a reminder of the boundless possibilities for life that can emerge out of apparent impossibility. Now, some of y'all might not be people of faith. Divinity schools are filled with people who don't believe this stuff, right? But what he says is he urges all of us to acknowledge the grim realities of the present without being hostage to them. As Jesus was not a prisoner of the event of the cross, we are not destined to be prisoners of the events of our individual or collective lives. Jesus didn't let death have the last word, and we cannot let the current social arrangement have the last word. We can imagine new possibilities, new formations, new realities, new social worlds, new selves. And that's what the abolitionist world is about. We can really dream of a world, a radical freedom dream that says that we don't need police and prisons because we will invest in such a way that they will no longer be necessary. They don't go away magically. We invest in the world that is not yet. And that's what we got to do.
Thank you. All my divinity school students out there are like freaking out right now because, you know, we needed that. We needed that. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. You said like, why'd you have me go last? But that's why I had you go last, because I knew that you would come through and just really bring together what I see as like the solution, which is abolition, like period. And I see, Sarah, you were like nodding and snapping, and I just do want to give you a chance to respond before I go into some of the questions that have been posed, if you would like, or I can go into the questions.
It's just really moving to be here together with all these threads and to be doing it. And I think to connect backwards a bit historically and theologically there, the Doctrine of Discovery was a papal bull written in 1455. It's the construct and bedrock for international legal relations and has allowed for colonization and for claiming of land and for seeing folks as less than human. 1455, this is before Columbus sails. And it was originally written with regards to West Africa, resolving a dispute between Spain and Portugal. And so the ways in which this conversation is so connected across the diaspora is critical. And also then to think about the ways in which Columbus was the first cop over here in the so-called Americas, an enforcer of the state with lethal power to do whatever and create systems that perpetuated dehumanization. And so this also means that this struggle around abolition is also a decolonial struggle and looks at the interlocking systems of oppression there. And so this is why, to some extent, during the latest uprisings of Black liberation through BLM, the statues of Columbus have been coming down, because we're recognizing the connections between all of our struggles and all of our spirits as we do this work.
So beautiful. Thank you. I want to give voice to those who are in the audience. Some of the questions that have come up, who any of you are welcome to answer. The first one that I see that we could potentially talk about, again, this panel only goes to 1:10 and we are a punctual group, but what are the tips to build partnerships across geographies and groups facing police violence? Because I think this is like at the very center of what all of this is talking about. And so whoever feels inclined to answer, please do.
For me, solidarity is built on a couple of things. One, I think to the extent that we can understand the other people's context, I think is significant. You know, one of the things that happened after Ferguson summer was a bunch of us went over to Palestine, and we actually saw, we were able to be, you know, sort of engaged witnesses, as Malcolm said, to what was happening in the West Bank and what was happening inside of the state of Israel. So for us, that was an important moment, but you don't necessarily have to go there to appreciate it. But I think solidarity has to be built on an understanding of the specific dynamics of that context. And sometimes when we talk solidarity, we frame it as sameness, right? Oh, they're like us. Oh, we're oppressed the way they're oppressed. And I think understanding that we can show solidarity and build with folk without necessarily having the exact same social dynamics, the way that the state operates in the context of anti-Black racism is a very US specific thing. It's not the only place where it happens, but it's a very US specific thing that will be very different than how Palestinians are treated, for example, in the West Bank, right? They're racialized as Palestinians, but you know, being an Afro-Palestinian isn't the thing that makes you vulnerable to premature death, right? It's being Palestinian. You know, Douglas raises the point, you know, again, this idea around, you know, well, yeah, what happens when the officers are all Black, right? How do we understand that? What if they're all of the same, if we're all of the same sort? What are the dynamics that then make difference happen? So I have to understand those contexts. So I think we need to delve in, we need to study, we need to analyze, but we don't need to locate the places where we're exactly the same in order to produce a kind of solidarity politics or praxis.
Absolutely. The next question, because I do want to try to get through as many of these as possible, is from Elizabeth, who says, along the lines of community solutions Sarah Nahar enumerated for dire crimes like murder and rape, how do we use the radical imagination of restoration at the point of discovery of the crime? Structures of power and social equality need to be reimagined to prevent desperation that leads to these acts of violence and to enable healing. But how can we start reimagining justice for those crimes while the new structures of care are put in place?
I'll jump in and thank you to the person who both wrote the question and you started to partially answer it yourself around the restoration aspects, around the conversational aspects. What I would challenge as an action that each of us can take after this is to start a conversation with one other person about both cases of more extreme and less extreme situations, and about what reimaginings you can think of. I guarantee that in that conversations, the complexities will emerge. You'll find the spot where your thinking gets stuck, and you may have a clue on how to unstick that thinking. It is literally moment by moment that we discern And I think about moving a lot of money, and like Denver did, towards these pilot projects, because they are producing the data that then could also nurture your conversation and how someone else somewhere else got unstuck at that moment. And how I think it relates to what Oluwole was saying is that as we do this work, we will be beginning to shed our colonial philosophies and codes of conduct towards recognizing ones that feel more natural and more connected. So we are not projecting a particular future, but a commitment to the journey of getting there and to encountering what Douglas mentioned. Eventually, we will get unstuck enough that we will find ourselves facing police unions with a lot of data, solutions, ideas, thoughts, and imaginations, and they will come with theirs. And that is a moment in which we need to be prepared to bring all of our resources to bear, to invite them also to get unstuck from those colonial philosophies and codes of conduct. We can do this hard thing.
I agree. Perhaps Oluwole or Douglas, you could speak to, Dr. Kivoy, you could speak to this other question. How can we come together on a global level to break the economic and political power of arms manufacturers? They have global reach and influence over policing and militarization in general. Actually, of course, all of you can speak to this, but.
Thank you very much. And I'm grateful to the person who asked the question. Number one, the kind of leaders we elect is critical. If we elect a demagogue, then we should be ready to pay the consequences. People who believe in brutality. But if you're going to elect leaders like the leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, and she has been able to overcome some resistance from within her own country on this whole issue of integrating immigrant families. I'm just using that as an example to show that leaders we elect are very, very important towards ensuring that you have got humane policing agencies. Because who gives these police departments and military equipment? It's the political leaders. So it boils down to the individuals we elect into office, right from the community level. I think that's my take on that. And then also, we have got social media, we have got the internet. We can share these things on the online forums so that we are able to see what is going on in this country or in this part of the country or in this region. Because some of the things that happen in the world, most of them are never reported. But the moment we start reporting and exposing them, the perpetrators, the people who manufacture these weapons, will be scared. Like what the weapons that are being used in Yemen, it was discovered that they were coming from United States of America and the United Kingdom. Only the Germany leader said she would not sell arms to Saudi Arabia because the arms were being used to kill innocent people in Yemen. And that's the point, the leaders we elect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one thing that is very, very central is that in solving a problem, you still need government to be part of the process. And I'm going to give you an instance in Nigeria when COVID-19 pandemics hit the country. There was a time that the incident of the number of people that were killed by the police officers who were trying to enforce the lockdown directive was actually more than the number of people that have been killed by COVID-19 itself. So what I'm trying to bring out of this is that on the part of I think you need a global governance that will come to the reality that global militarization of police is a scourge that is affecting every country. So it should be on the front burner with the United Nations and with all other multilateral institutions and agencies that are working at the cross section of economy, political, and human rights. I've not seen that. We need to sustain that conversation. And in terms of community organizing, what we have not seen is a situation whereby this conversation is sustained over a long period of time, to put it on the front burner for global governance, to focus attention on global militarization of police. What we have seen are spurious attempts to talk about these issues when there are issues of George Floyd or maybe NSAS issues in Nigeria or any incident of police brutality in Kenya. You find out that the conversation sustains more than 2 to 3 months and everything goes back to the old normal. So I think the way we have addressed issues of HIV/AIDS, the way we are addressing COVID-19 now, issues of police brutality must also be put on the front burner, because you need a global governance to address issues of police brutality. And it speaks to what Dr. Mark talked about in terms of the transnational nature of the crisis that we have at hand. And I think we also need transnational solutions, governments coming together regionally, globally, in putting this on the front burner and addressing it scarcely. And we need to sustain community organizing to get this done, and also leverage the power of the technology, particularly the social media. Thank you.
Of course. Oh, thank you so much. I feel like we're all learning so much. I feel like I'm in class right now. Like, I'm such a student at heart. It's insane. The last question I have that I really want to highlight is from Steve Nunez, who is actually presenting later today in the student panels, who is amazing, brilliant. Please come and listen to all of our student panelists for their papers, present their papers. He says, regarding abolitionist methods, the defund model toward police abolition seems to dominate the discourse, yet it seems that I can never say this word, municipalities, you know what I'm saying, willingness to defund police is commensurate with the people's use of revolutionary counter-violence. For example, burning down police stations seems to elicit a greater response and increased defunding. At the federal level, it is abundantly clear that the Biden-Harris administration have no interest in entertaining abolitionist discourse whatsoever. At the same time, the defund discourse doesn't necessarily suggest the abolition of police, prisons, capitalism, etc., which often leads to a massive liberalization, sterilization, and appropriation of the conversation into a reform frame, which we've all sort of touched on a little bit. What kinds of alternative modes, aside from the defund discourse, toward abolition are the panelists thinking about and working through? And in the nature of time, Dr. Hill, do you want to close us out on this answer?
I said, sure. I mean, I don't begin from the place of saying that I wouldn't concede that it's not working. You know, there are a lot of discourses that a year in, 2 years in, 3 years in, you know, aren't persuasive to people. And then time goes on. I mean, hell, Black Lives Matter wasn't, I mean, I remember having to push Hillary Clinton to not say all lives matter on stage, right? Not me personally, but a group of activists. Remember when she first was asked, is she from Black Lives Matter? She said all lives matter. And then when public sentiment shifted, she shifted. And then she was educated on the issue. So I don't assume that I wouldn't assume that, right? There's this idea, and President Obama has been one of those people who weighed in on this and said this, you know, that somehow it's a bad slogan or it doesn't resonate with the people. I mean, you know, abolition now for slavery didn't, you know, women's suffrage now didn't resonate with the people. We have to hold a moral steadiness, I think, when we talk about these issues. And I think that, quite frankly, defunding, I already think is a step below abolition. So I want to hold on to the defunding conversation at the very least. But strategically, it's not just, and one more thing, I don't mean to suggest that abolition is new or defunding is new. There's a long tradition of folks doing this work, particularly Black radical feminists who we will always want to acknowledge, whether it's Mariame Kaba, whether it's Angela Davis, whether it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore. We have to do this work. This is Joy James. This is all part of the work as well. But the world is catching up, and so let's give it time. But abolition isn't just about the discourse, right? It's about the tactics. In the same way people said, look, I hate Obamacare. And then them same Republicans that hated Obamacare, like, but I like my pre-existing condition. I like my kids covered to the 25. I like this, I like this. They just didn't like it because it was Obamacare. So in addition to the language of abolition, let's talk about what we can do. Closing privately funded prisons. That's an abolitionist move. Ending cash bail is an abolitionist move. We don't want reform. We want radical transformation. But reforms are okay if they're not compromising the radical transformation, right? And that's the question. That's been the dilemma of existence is resistance. Excuse me, that's not of critical resistance. For decades now. It's like, will this reform actually make people believe prisons are salvageable? If so, we don't want it. Is this something that'll make people's lives better while still moving us toward dismantling the prison industrial complex? If so, we want it. And ending cash bail and ending privatized prisons are two examples of that. Taking money out of police departments and investing it in drug treatment and mental health services, that is a form of abolition, right? So I think we can continue to do the strategic work at the same time.
Yeah, I must say though, you're pretty patient for what's about. I don't know. I guess like I'm like, young. So I'm like, let's make change now, abolition now. Like, why can't we all just change our mindsets now? I don't understand. But I see what you're saying. And I think, yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Dr. Hill, Dr. Kivoy, Oluwole, Sarah, it has been such a pleasure, such an honor.